Hello, everyone. I'm Professor Sexton with a short video lecture on two poems, Lawrence Dunbar, We Wear the Mask, and Claude McKay's If We Must Die. This lecture is going to be relatively short because there's not too much detail that I'm going to go into with both of these poems. But what you need to do in addition to listening to the video lecture, make sure that you also read the poems for yourself. So the first one that I'm going to bring up is Paul Laurence Dunbar, We Wear the Mask. File is loading, and let me just enlarge that. Okay, so here's the poem. We wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile. With torn and bleeding hearts we smile, and mouth with mirrored subtleties. Why should the world be overwise in counting all our tears and sighs? Nay, let them only see us while we wear the mask. We smile, but O great Christ, our cries to thee from tortured souls arise. We sing, but oh, the clay is vile beneath our feet, and long the mile, but let the world dream otherwise. We wear the mask. Okay, so this poem is very interesting because for someone coming to this poem who doesn't know who Paul Laurence Dunbar is or was, you might have a very different interpretation. So let's just look at the poem first without knowing who the speaker is. Two things that you need to point out about this poem are that's significant. Notice how the speaker uses we. So instead of the speaker speaking about I, this speaker is speaking about a group of people. It is similar to the Gwendolyn Brooks poem that we read called We Real Cool," because once again, in that speaker, that's a collective voice of a group of people. In the Gwendolyn Brooks poem, we know that we belongs to those seven pool players because Brooks gives us that subtitle under the title of her poem. And We Wear the Mask, we don't really know who this we is. Um, but as we read the poem, what becomes clear is that whoever this group of people are, that they are suffering. You can see this in line 4, where it says, with torn and bleeding hearts, we smile. You can see this later in lines 7, and counting all our tears and sighs. You can see this further where lines 11, and to thee from tortured souls arise. So whoever the we is in this poem, it is a group of people who have suffered. And what the poem is about is how this group of people decide not to show the world that they are being affected by their suffering. And this is why they wear a mask. It's the mask that grins and lies. So the mask that this group of people put on, it doesn't allow other people to know how much they're suffering. And so they kind of keep that pain and suffering on the inside. And then one of the questions that you ask yourself is, why exactly are they doing that? And you see this a little bit in the second stanza, where you have the line, why should the world be overwise in counting all our tears and sighs? So there's a sense that the speaker or the collective group doesn't feel that the world should know how much they're suffering. What the poem doesn't indicate is why the speaker feels this way. Why is it that this speaker feels that the world should not see how much they're suffering? And so that leaves it open to your interpretation. And one way you can approach that is, why does anyone not let other people see that they're suffering? Could it be that it might be perceived as a weakness? Could it be that it could be used against them? The poem doesn't make that clear. Um, but it's a very interesting poem because it kind of asks you, what do you think about this group of people who are doing this? Now, let me give you some background information about this poem. Paul Laurence Dunbar was an African American male writer. So if we assume that the identity of the poet is in reference to the we of the poem, then we can read this poem as it being African Americans who have decided to wear this mask and not let the world see how much they're suffering, and to let African Americans are smiling on the outside, yet on the inside there's all this pain and suffering that's going on inside them. And then that leads to the question, um, does it change your reading of this poem now that you know that it's African Americans that most likely Dunbar is referencing? So now that you know who that we is, does it change the way you read the poem? This is not a question that I can answer for you. This is a question of interpretation. So this is one of those ones that you would have to explain. And the answer could be yes or no. It's either or. Because once again, the question is, does it change the way you interpret the poem? And so, if you were to answer this question, you would need to explain why it does or why it does not. Another question that you might want to ask of this poem, even though Paul Laurence Dunbar is an African American male and he's writing about the African American experience, is this a poem that can apply to another minoritized group? So, is this a poem that can apply to members of the LGBTQ community? Is it a poem that can apply to Hispanics, Asian Americans, Italian Americans who were discriminated against? So is the poem open in that sense? And once again, um, the answer to that question is yes or no. And the strength of your argument is how well you support that. Now, what you would want to do is you'll want to look at the poem itself, to pick particular lines that gives you that impression, and that's where you kind of that's the struggle when it comes to literary interpretation. So that's We Wear the Mask. Don't have much more to say about that. So the other one is a poem by Claude McKay called If We Must Die. And also, I owe you an apology. I noticed that on the paper assignment, and I just caught this this past week, that I had the Claude McKay poem If We America, and I realized that I was thinking of another Claude McKay poem when I wrote the paper assignment, not realizing that the poem that I was using in class was a different one. So I apologize on that front. So, if we must die, let us read this poem. If we must die, let it not be like halls hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our cursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us, though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave, and for their thousand blows deal one death blow. What though before us lies the open grave? Like men we face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying but fighting back. This poem, as well, similar to We Wear the Mask, notice once again the speaker is using we. So we have this collective, if we must die. Similar to Paul Laurence Dunbar, We Wear the Mask, we don't know exactly who this we is. So we don't know who this we represents. However, we still get some information about them, um, and the pain and suffering that they have undergone. Notice this part here, let it not be like hogs hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, making their mock at our cursive lot. Cursive lot means like a negative connotation that the people have of them. Um, I read this poem in juxtaposition to We Wear the Mask. And because here you have a very different reaction to pain and suffering. And Paul Laurence Dunbar, We Wear the Mask, you have a group of people where it seems that they're just more willing to not fight back and to kind of suffer in silence, and just to pretend like everything is fine. Whereas in this poem, you have a group of people who decide we're not going to go down that way. And notice also in this poem, the we seem to think more positive about themselves. I mean, yes, they know that they are outnumbered because you can see this in lines 11, where it says, "And for their thousand blows, deal one death blow." So it does indicate that this we, they're outnumbered. But even though they are outnumbered, you seem that you get the sense that they have a stronger pride about themselves, and you can see this in the words that they use, like even in these first two lines where they says, "If we must die, let it not be like hogs." So when they're not going to go to the slaughter like a hog, they're going to go to the slaughtered like men, like heroes. Look at the words here. "Oh, let us nobly die, our precious blood." So there's a greater sense in this poem of the speaker and the group that he is representing, having more pride in themselves. And notice here too, when you get to line 9, notice how that begins with "O Kingsman." And it shows this relationship between the different people who make up the we. And it's interesting to compare that to the last poem, because even though the last poem uses we, my sense is that in this poem, there's a stronger connection between the we of this poem, because he does call, and I'm saying he, it could be she, he does call them "old kingsmen." So the sense that they're united. And so you just get a sense that this group of people are not willing to suffer in silence. This group of people are not willing simply to smile and pretend like everything is okay. They are willing to fight, and they are willing to fight to even knowing that they might lose. Because look at the last line. The last line is a very powerful line. "Pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back." And it's kind of like this sense that they are outnumbered, and they know that they most likely will not win this. Yet they're still going to fight. And this poem reads like any of those speeches, like if you've ever seen any movie or TV show where there's about to be a battle and the minority, and I mean minority in terms of number, is fighting the majority, and there's just too many of them, and there's no way, if you're looking at the odds, that they should win. But it's kind of like that speech that is always given, that we will fight, to the death, and even though a lot of us might die, we're going to die nobly. I don't know how many of you were Game of Thrones people and fans and watched that, but even in the last, I think it was the last season when they fought the White Walkers, even that, they were outnumbered, and they should not have won that. But I don't want to spoil it for those of you who have not seen it. But you can kind of see a speech given that way. You can go back to this old movie called 300. I mean, it's not that old, but like it's the same thing there. So that kind of sense that even though we're outnumbered, and even though they might have more artillery, and even though they may have more power and they have more strength, we're not just going to submit and cow down. So it's a very different type of reading here. Once again, this poem, Claude McKay, is an African American author. And so if we take the association that the identity of the poet is in reference to the identity of the we. Once again, we're looking at African Americans, but the same questions that I ask about this poem apply, the same questions that I asked about We Wear the Mask can also apply here. Does it change the meaning of the poem, knowing that the we is most likely African Americans? And even if the we is most likely African Americans, cannot the poem apply to any other minoritized group? So once again, you can ask the same questions of We Wear the Mask as you can If We Must Die. And then also another interesting thing is to compare these two poems side by side and look at these two different ways of dealing with um, pain, suffering, a minoritized status. So there are two, I mean, these two poems are very good to discuss and juxtaposition with each other. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is it for this lecture. As I said before, not too much to go on here. If we were in person and had an open discussion, it would be a little bit richer in terms of what we can talk about because then there'll be feedback from you and I can speak to that. However, that is just a brief review of both of these poems. Hope it gives you something to think about. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video lecture. Bye.